Hey everyone, it's Danny T here, and today I'm going to talk to you about Aperture. This is the third lesson, the first two were online on my blog, and this is the third one following up on video, so I hope you like it. Today I'm sat in this lovely bluebell field. It's on the outskirts of Bristol. I know everyone's going to be asking me where it is. I'm sorry I can't tell you because it's private land and I know the owner, but as with everything in life, it's just a Google away, so just Google bluebells and I'm sure you'll find loads of great spots. It's currently beginning of May at the moment, and it's a great time to get out there and shoot bluebells, so get out there, grab your camera and get to it. So today we're going to talk more about Aperture, and we're going to be looking at loads of different demonstrations through the lens, so you can actually see through my camera as I'm changing the aperture the effect that that is having on your pictures. And aperture is the one key principle behind getting your depth of field, and your depth of field is the amount that's in focus in your shot. When it comes to taking pictures of bluebells like these, depth of field is really quite important for any macro photography, because you really want to determine how much of these flowers are in focus and how much they're not. And certainly with macro photography, you have a lot of blur behind flowers, and it really looks great if you can get that nice blur behind them, a very shallow depth of field. So the two things that affect the depth of field are the aperture and the distance to the subject. So the lower the number on your aperture, so something like f2.8, f4, the shorter your depth of field is going to be. And for your distance from your subject, the closer you are, the shorter it's going to be. So how do you get the shallowest depth of field? You put your aperture number as low as possible and you get as close to it as you possibly can. And with macro photography in general, close is almost always better. And low down is even better. Imagine if you're taking a picture of a child, you wouldn't want to loom over them and shoot down over them because it looks quite imposing. But it's the same for macro photography. You want to get down really low and take a picture of these flowers really close up and at their level. You'll see a lot more detail, and there's a lot more opportunities to get some shots that you might not have thought of before, and you'll see so much more of the flower world. So we're going to get to it, and our first shot is going to be looking at one of these nice bluebells behind a log, and we're going to see just how changing our aperture is going to affect the results of our shot. Okay guys, so here's our first shot. Now your depth of field begins from your focal point, i.e. wherever you focus on, your depth of field goes from there and further into the shot. So depending on what your aperture is, that depth of field will vary, but it will always start at your focal point. And on this particular shot, our focal point is this bluebell in the foreground that you can see. So you can see currently that that's sharp and everything behind it is blurred. Well, the reason for that is because my lens is currently set at f2.8. So that is the highest aperture that it will go to, and we say highest, remember it's an inverse law for aperture. But again, just remember that the lower the number on your camera, the shallower the depth of field. So with a number as low as 2.8, what we're finding is we have a lot of blur behind our subject that's currently in focus, and that's this bluebell here. If we put the number of our aperture up, what we're going to see is more of those blurred flowers behind it coming into focus. So let's try it now. This is at f2.8, that's at f4, f5.6, f8, f13, and all the way up to f22. And can you see how big a difference this is? So now we've got the bluebell in the foreground, we've also got the flowers in focus, the tree behind it in focus, and that is really the power of aperture. It's that amount of depth of field or lack of depth of field that you can control. And the way that you can start using aperture is through a setting on your camera called Aperture Priority. On a Nikon that will be an A on your dial on the top, on a Canon it will be an AV. So let's just go back and look at it again. So this is f22, that's the highest aperture in terms of number that my camera goes to. We're going to come all the way back, right back, f13, f8, f5.6, f2.8. What a big difference that makes. And depending on what camera you have, the depth of field for that particular f-stop will vary. So f8 on my camera, on this particular lens, which is a Nikon 70-200, the actual depth of field for that f8 is going to be different than the depth of field on the lens on your camera, unless it's exactly the same lens. So bear that in mind, and really it's a case of just going out and testing out your apertures and seeing how they work. But there is one thing that we can use that's going to really help us see our apertures through the lens before we take the shot. We'll look at that in the next cut. So we talked about seeing your depth of field through your camera before you take the shot. And this can be done in two ways. If you have a compact camera or one of the high-end Canon or Nikon cameras, a lot of them have a live view setting, and in that live view you can essentially see what the picture is going to look like before you take the shot. So you can switch it to live view, change your aperture in live view, and you'll see the effects of that aperture change on your depth of field in your live view picture before you take the shot. So you can get a good idea of exactly how much is in focus before you press that shutter button. There's also a depth of field preview button on some digital SLRs, and what this does is it moves your aperture to the aperture that you set to take the shot with. Now why does it have to move it? Well, when you go to look through your viewfinder with a digital SLR, it will always show you the image at the widest aperture on your lens. And the reason being is that lets in the most light, so you're able to compose and focus better with more light. When you actually take that shot, you might find that there's actually more in focus than there was when you were looking through the lens itself. And that's because you've chosen an f-stop which is a higher number than the widest aperture on your SLR. So you look through it, it shows you as much as it can, as light as it can by using the widest aperture, but then you take the shot and actually the aperture it uses is a lot smaller, so more is in focus. So with the depth of field preview, all you can do is just press that button and it will show you what your picture is going to look like in terms of your depth of field before you take that shot. And essentially it will have the same effect as it did in the last shot we had. For example, at the moment I'm looking through my viewfinder and it's f2.8 because that's the widest aperture that the camera can see, and it lets in the most light. When I actually go to take the shot, I'm actually set at f8, so the actual shot will look like this. If I was set at a higher f-stop, it would be even more in focus. Here, that's f22, and as you can see, lots more of the background is in focus than I originally put. So just bear that in mind when you go to take the shot. The other thing that affects your depth of field is your distance to the subject. The further you are away from the subject, the more depth of field you're going to get than if you're closer up. I'm going to demonstrate this for you by carrying my camera towards this branch in the middle. As you can see, the branch is what's currently in focus, and a lot of what's behind it is, it's not in focus, but then it's not out of focus. It's kind of semi in focus at this point. As I walk towards the branch, my aperture number, which is currently 2.8, is going to stay the same throughout. But take a look what happens to the background as I walk towards it. And I'm sorry if it's a bit joggy, but I've got to walk around some shrubbery here. Look at the background as it goes out of focus. Can you see how I'm getting closer and closer? And that background is just getting more and more out of focus. See the difference there? To here. Now I'm about 1.5 meters away from the branch, whereas before I was more like 7 or 8 meters away from the branch. And here the background is considerably more out of focus than it was before. Let me just walk back to the branch and demonstrate that again. Again, here I'm about 7 or 8 meters away from the branch, and if I zoom out, you'll be able to see just how far I am. There you go. As I walk towards the branch, the background is going to get more and more out of focus. To there. Now, the actual distance that you can get to the subject will depend on your focal distance of your lens. Some lenses will need a certain distance in order to be able to focus properly. I'm about 1.5 meters from this branch now, and if I get any closer, it's not going to be able to focus because that's about its minimal focal distance that it requires. Macro lenses, on the other hand, can focus very, very close up to 10 centimeters or so. So depending on what type of lens you have will depend on how close you can get. And the closer you can get, the shallower your depth of field. The final thing I want to talk to you about is compression. Now, compression is something that you can use with zoom lenses, and it doesn't affect the depth of field in your photos, but it affects how the foreground and the background appear. And it's achieved through zooming with your lens. The more zoom you have, the more compression you'll get. And I'm just going to touch on this today because in the next class we'll be looking at composition and how compression can affect composition. But compression is something that you can bear in mind when taking especially macro shots or city shots where you have lots of buildings, because it has a strong effect on how your picture looks afterwards. And I'm just going to show you through this live view right now what that compression effect looks like. As you zoom your camera in, what will happen is the background will have the appearance that it's coming towards you. So the picture is essentially becoming flatter. That depth that you can currently see, so you've got the bluebell in the foreground and the other bluebells behind it, that depth is going to start getting lost because you're zooming further in and the background is being pulled towards you. Let me just show you. I'm going to zoom in now and watch how the flowers come towards you. I'm still at the same aperture, but they have that appearance of being pulled towards you. And likewise, if I zoom out, they have that appearance of being pushed back. So if I were to zoom into this flower again, so I'm just going to zoom all the way in here, you can see that suddenly there's a lot less in my background, and what there is appears to be flatter. And that's something that gives a really strong effect in macro photography when you're taking images, because it creates this wonderful background of different colours that aren't distracting because of their distance away from you. They're merely just a myriad of colours that can accentuate picture that you're taking. And as I say, we'll look into more on this in my next tutorial, but that's just something to bear in mind. And if you do have a zoom lens, give it a try when you're taking your shots. Well, that's it from me today, and I hope you've learned a lot about aperture and really got an idea of what aperture looks like when you really see it through the lens. So now it's time for you to get out there and start shooting. If you haven't used Aperture Priority before, then get yourself in that mode and take some shots. All you've got to do is set the aperture number yourself, and your camera will do the rest. And it will make a huge difference on your photography. It will help you learn, and with these tutorials we'll keep on learning throughout. So if you've liked this tutorial, please post a link on my website, that's www.dannyt.co.uk, or on Facebook. Tick the like button for me, leave me a comment, and I'd love to see the photos that you get out of this. So please post any photos that you've got on my website or on Facebook, or link to me on Flickr, and we can catch up through that. I hope you've enjoyed it, and see you again next time.